Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's video, we shall be appreciating the histology of the urinary bladder. It's an essential histology on the urinary system. If you are coming across my channel at the first time, don't hesitate to subscribe so that you get notification when I upload video on human histology. Let's proceed. The first thing first is the introduction. First of all, let's give a concept of the urinary bladder, because in histology, we talk about the linings that covers the organs. That is what we discuss on histological aspect of the tissue. Now, what is urinary bladder? Urinary bladder is a muscular bag which stores urine temporarily and discharge it periodically via the urethra during maturation, that is voiding of the urine. This is a muscular bag which stores urine temporarily and get it discharged periodically via the urethra during maturation, which is the voiding of the bladder. That is the concept of the urinary bladder. Now, the next outline that we shall be discussing is the walls of the urinary bladder. The walls of the urinary bladder. The walls of the urinary bladder are made up of three layers. There are three layers that are composed of the walls of the urinary bladder. You have the inner layer, we have the middle layer, we have the outer layer. Now, the inner layer is formed by the mucous membrane. It is formed by the mucous membrane or the mucosa. So it is formed by the mucous membrane, while the middle layer is formed by a thick coat smooth muscle layer or a muscular coat. Thick coat smooth muscle layer, smooth muscles. Now, the outer layer is formed by the serous membrane or the serous layer. It is formed by the serous membrane. So these are the layers that forms the walls of the urinary bladder. Before we dive into these layers, these are the histological diagrams of the urinary bladder. This diagram you are seeing on my left hand side is the photomicrograph of the urinary bladder. This is the photomicrograph of the urinary bladder, how it is seen on the microscope. Why this on this side is how to draw it in med school. This is how we draw or we represent those things that we saw on the microscope, which is this in medical board exam. This is how we are going to draw the histology of the urinary bladder. So as we proceed, we shall be discussing the features of those tissues. Now, let's begin with the mucous membrane. The mucous membrane of the urinary bladder is formed by the transitional epithelium, which is a specialized form of epithelium classified under the epithelium on a specialized function. So it is formed by a transitional epithelium. is formed by a transitional epithelium. Now, recall that it forms the inner layer of the urinary bladder. This is the diagrams that represent the urinary bladder. The inner layer are those ones that forms the inner wall of the urinary bladder. Now watch, this is the transitional epithelium. Which can be otherwise called the urothelium, because it is a specialized epithelium found on the urinary system. It is located on the ureter, it's located on the bladder, it's located on the urethra. So we have urothelium. So the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder is lined by the transitional epithelium. And again, that it does not contain any muscularis mucosa. There is no muscularis mucosa on the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder. Now, when the urinary bladder is empty, the mucous membrane is thrown into numerous folds. It is thrown into numerous folds. When the urinary bladder is empty, that is when there is no urine on it, the mucous membrane is thrown into numerous folds, which does what? Which disappears when it is distended. That is when it has urine. Because when the bladder is empty, those mucous membrane are thrown into folds. Now, when the bladder has urine, it disappears. And that fold, that longitudinal fold, is similar to the activities of the mucous membrane in the ureter. I've done video on the histology of the ureter, which conducts urine from the renal pelvis of the kidney to the urinary bladder. I've done the video. Go and watch it. You could see that the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder is same thing to the mucous membrane of the ureter, because they contain longitudinal fold, which appears like a star-shaped appearance. So it is the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder that makes the urinary bladder, even the ureter, to have a longitudinal fold. But when it gets distended, that is when it has urine, those folds disappears. That is how it works. Now you have to understand again that the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder has mucous gland, especially or specifically towards the internal urethral orifice. That is where the mucous gland of the urinary bladder is located. Particularly, they are found on the mucous membrane. They have what? Mucous gland. So those are the features of the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder. You have to understand again that when the urinary bladder is distended, that is, it has urine, the lining epithelium is usually thin. It becomes thinner. Yeah, the lining epithelium becomes thinner. The lining epithelium becomes thinner when it has urine. The lining epithelium becomes thinner, which is the what? The transitional epithelium. It becomes thinner. And it becomes thinner because the epithelial cells has the ability to do what? To change shape and shift over one another. Because if you watch the transitional epithelium, if you have read or watched video about the epithelial cells, this transitional epithelium does not have a single layer of cell. It has several layers of cell. That is why it is similarly classified under stratified epithelial cells that have several layers of cell. It is not on simple epithelium, because simple epithelium have single layers of cells. So that is how the features looks like. So when the urinary bladder is distended, has urine, the lining epithelium becomes thinner. That occurs because the epithelial cells has the ability to change shape and shift over one another. You have to understand again that the transitional epithelium that lines the urinary bladder and other areas of the urinary passages has the ability to withstand osmotic pressures that is being caused by various concentrations of the urine, and also has the ability to resist toxins produced by the urine. So that is the features of the transitional epithelium found on the mucous membrane, which form the inner layer of the urinary bladder. Okay, the next, and you have to understand again that before we dive into the thick coat smooth muscle, there is a connective tissue which the transitional epithelium rests upon. That is called the lamina propria. Recall that this remains the transitional epithelium, which can be called urothelium. Now, here is the lamina propria. It is a specialized connective tissue by which the transitional epithelium rests upon. Here also is the lamina propria. So that is how they are being fashioned. The next we shall be discussing is the middle layer, which is being formed by the thick coat smooth muscle. So let's go. Now, the middle layer of the urinary bladder is formed by the thick coat smooth muscle. From the name, you should know that the muscle is thick. You have to understand that the smooth muscle that forms the urinary bladder is thick, and appears like a form of meshwork. Yeah, similar to the smooth muscles of the ureter. Go and watch my video on ureter. They appear like a form of what? Meshwork. Yeah. And the smooth muscles of the urinary bladder has layers. The internal and external layer, or the inner and the outer layer. The internal and the external smooth muscle fibers of the urinary bladder are so important. Now, in between these two layers exists a thicker layer of circular or oblique smooth muscle fibers. In between the two layers exists the what? A thicker layer of circular or oblique smooth muscle fibers. It is the contraction of this smooth muscle that leads to the what? Emptying of the urinary bladder. Yes. And that is why the smooth muscles of the urinary bladder can be called the detrusor muscle. They can be called the detrusor muscle. Detrusor muscles. Yeah. Now watch. These and these are the muscle coat of the urinary bladder, which has the internal and the external layer. The muscle coat, which has internal and external layer. That is how it is being done. Okay. Recall that the features of this muscle coat, they are not distinct. Their distinct features are not distinguished. It is same feature that the smooth muscles of the ureter has. Their features are not what? Distinct. They don't have a distinguished what? Feature. That is the muscle coat of the urinary bladder. You have to understand again that towards the junction, above the junction of the urinary bladder and the ureter, there exists a circular fibers which thickened to form a sphincter vesicae. Yeah, because there is a junction between the ureter and the what? Urinary bladder. So something does in that place. The circular fibers, that is those smooth muscles, the circular fibers are being what? Thickened to form sphincter vesicae. To form what? Sphincter vesicae. Yeah. You know what is sphincter now? It regulates the entry and like the influx and exflux of substances. Get. So that is it. Now, you have to understand that when we talk about these features, the muscle coat, they are so profound. They are very important because without the contraction of the smooth muscles of the ureter, the bladder, of the bladder, not ureter, the bladder wouldn't have been able to void its content. That is micturition. Okay? Same thing applicable to this diagram. Here and here forms the muscle coat. The muscle coat. Yeah. The internal and its external layer. Okay? Now, we still have interstitial connective tissue. Yes. There exists interstitial connective tissue here. Interstitial connective tissue. Look at it here. Interstitial connective tissue. Interstitial connective tissue, CT. Interstitial connective tissue. So the next we shall be discussing is the outer layer, which is the serous membrane or the serous layer. Now, the serous layer forms the superior surface of the urinary bladder, which is being covered by the mesothelium of the perineum. Of the peritoneum. It is being covered by the mesothelium. Mesothelium, recall that is secretory now. Mesothelium of the peritoneum, right? Why the inferior surface of the urinary bladder is covered by adventitia. Likewise, the outer layer of the ureter is also formed by the adventitia. Go and watch my video on ureter. Same thing applicable with the inferior surface of the urinary bladder is covered by adventitia, which has a fibroelastic connective tissue, which houses the blood vessel, the nerves, and the lymphatics. Right? So watch here. This is the outer layer of the urinary bladder, which is being formed by the serous layer. The serous layer. Recall that this serous layer is also the outer layer of the peritoneum, right? That is the peritoneal cavity, which houses the abdominal organs. So that is how it is being fashioned. So this serous membrane covers or forms the superior surface of the urinary bladder, which is being covered by the mesothelium of the peritoneum, right? While the inferior surface of the urinary bladder is also being formed by the adventitia, which contains a fibroelastic connective tissue that houses the blood vessels, the nerves, and the lymphatics. So that is how they are being fashioned. So we have discussed the mucous membrane, the thick coat smooth muscle, and the serous membrane, right? So that is how they are being fashioned. You have to understand again that The urinary bladder is easily recognized because the mucous membrane contains transitional epithelium. That is why it is easy to recognize under microscope, having 8 photomicrograph on this place. So the next outline we shall be discussing is the clinical relevance. The clinical relevance. The clinical relevance. Number 1 is cystitis. Cystitis is regarded as the lower UTI infection, lower urinary tract infection. Is an inflammation of the cells of the bladder. So that is how it works. It is one of the histological correlation of the urinary bladder. I believe we have done justice to the urinary bladder. We have discussed its histological features. That is the histological layers or the linings. Thank you so much for staying to the end of this class. I really appreciate.